At this point, we are now moving on to our third presenter, and that is going to be Toni Bowling. And Toni is also a senior in environmental studies and a minor in geography. And we're going to see two very different presentations from Toni coming up. The first one is a May 4th music video, and I'm going to let Toni introduce it if she wants to say anything before we attempt to show it, and hopefully this will work. So Toni, if you have anything you want to say before we try the video.
Okay, yes. I just had a brief little introduction just to give some background and context for anyone who maybe is not as familiar, since I am in the May 4th class this semester. So I put together this music video that incorporates, some music from the time. But this music video that I created is meant to show the escalation and tension over the Vietnam War and the increased influence of the counterculture in the anti-war movement led by students against the establishment that ultimately triggered a clash with the Ohio National Guard and students at Kent State that resulted in the deaths of 4 students on May 4th, 1970. Throughout the 1960s, student activism swept across the country and inspired the youth of America to join the growing social movements that were challenging the traditional ideals of the American dream and denouncing a war that many felt was unjust. Unlike the wars of their parents and grandparents, the Vietnam War was asking young people to fight in formless and frontless battles where the only sign of success was in body counts. And this ended up tarnishing the illusion of America's reputation as the good guys in many people's minds. This video shows how a youth-led revolution that had its core in peacefully protesting grew into a powerful force that was openly challenging their government's actions, which ultimately led to fear and retaliation that ended with the Ohio National Guard opening fire on students and revealing the consequences of fearing true dissent. I chose 3 different songs from this era and time. The 3 songs that I chose were Jefferson Airplane's Volunteers, Country Joe McDonald's I-Feel-Like-I'm-Fixin to Die Rag, and Crosby, Nash and Young, Find the Cost of Freedom. I chose these 3 songs from the time period that were speaking to the social and political actions taking place in the culture at the time. Jefferson Airplane song Volunteers opens the video, which sets the tone for activism and revolution going on. This is paired with clips showing soldiers flooding into Vietnam and volunteering their lives for their country, as well as clips of the growing counterculture who were also against the war and expanding their revolution of young volunteers. Then we follow, there's also news clips that are peppered in that are also showing context of what was happening, with Nixon and things like that, which then goes into a live version of Country Joe McDonald singing at Woodstock, which was a huge gathering of the counterculture and people who were actively protesting the war. This song is a seemingly lighthearted sing-along, but it actually is openly criticizing and mocking the indifference of the government and the establishment in sacrificing the lives of its young people for an unwinnable war. The final song is from Crosby, Nash and Young, and is called Find the Cost of Freedom. And this is paired with all the Kent State footage of the actual shooting in the day itself of the protests that were or the rally that was happening that day, which inevitably led to the confrontation with the National Guard. This song was actually written along with Ohio as a reaction to the events of Kent State on May 4th, as news of the killing spread across the country. And this only served to further unite the anti-war movement. My hope with this video is to show that we can't forget the lessons from this time in history when a war and social movements were fracturing the fabric of society by challenging America's values as a nation. And what happens when the fundamental right to protest actions by the actions of the government is suppressed and ignored. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope that you turn up the volume because it is better if you play it a little bit loud.
Toni?
Yes.
Okay, so
hopefully that worked.
We're gonna post that video as well, so that you can see it. I realize it had a little bit of a lag there, but I think you got the idea. And so, Toni, anything else that you want to say before we turn it over to questions that people may have?
Like I said, it's pretty, like I gave some context, but as most things like this, I'm open to interpretation. So there's a lot of layers that you can take from it. And so I'm curious to see, what people think.
Okay, so Toni is willing to take questions at this point, and our group is small, so if you can either I type them into the chat, or you can actually ask Toni yourselves if you unmute yourself. So either way.
Okay, Toni, I have just two questions. Out of all the songs that you could have chosen, why just those three? And how were you able to obtain the video documentation from the actual shooting?
I chose these. Well, I wanted to keep it in a time frame, so I definitely. I loved so much music from this time period, and so much of the music from that time was very socially aware of what was going on, and was speaking about the changes that were happening, and a lot of the revolution that was surrounding, the war and other movements at the time. So it was hard to narrow down three because there were a ton that I was considering. But I thought that Volunteers by Jefferson Airplane really like very distinctly spoke about revolution and joining together and, meeting people, and how this kind of, gathering of people really was the catalyst that, so many people, when they started gathering together, really, it came into perspective of, how many people there were and how many people were angered by this, and kind of, that kind of theme. Then I've always loved Country Joe McDonald's. I feel like feeling like I'm fixing to die rag. I feel it's one of the best anti-Vietnam War songs made, basically. And I've always thought it was such a good commentary about what was happening. And so I just thought that was such a perfect, especially live at Woodstock, where there's all these people who were all like thousands and thousands of people who were gathering together, who not only, it wasn't about the Vietnam War specifically, but this culture was coming in, to basically say they wanted to challenge, what society was like. And then actually, Dr. Post was the one who suggested doing the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young song, Find the Cost of Freedom, which I thought was a really good addition because it had the kind of tone that I thought was, somber and really spoke to the kind of emotion of this event. And that it was specifically written as a B-side to Ohio. So I thought it really paired well to kind of show this overarching kind of tone of where, it's just a bunch of people getting together, starting revolution, them being frustrated by not being listened to by their government, by Country Joe's song, and then the ultimate, consequence of all of this protesting, which is sacrifice, essentially. And then I forget what was the second question again. I'm sorry.
How were you able to obtain the actual video of this shooting?
Oh, yes. I used quite a bit of footage from Ken Burns' documentary, The Vietnam War. They had a little section in one of the videos, one of the episodes that covered a lot of the May 4th stuff. So a lot of footage I was getting from different pieces of that documentary because it had so much really good footage, live, real life footage from that time. So I basically, got quite a bit of it from that documentary, actually.
So there's a question that it says, what lessons do you think this period has for us today when once again we seem to see the escalation of tension and polarization in the United States?
I know, I feel like this, the lessons from this time period are very relevant to what we're going through today. We have so many issues that are very pressing. And again, there are so many different groups of people who are actively trying to change the society right now. So I think there are so many parallels to the 60s that we could, in the 70s, that we could really learn from still. But mostly that activism, protesting, dissent of things that you don't believe that is a future you want to live in your country, that you have the right to do that. And that, you know, part of some of why this escalated so much was because a lot of the government and administration and things like that, they're really trying to tamp down this kind of revolution that was happening, and they weren't listening to the young people, and they were misconstruing what they were actually trying to say at this time. And like the clip of Eva Jefferson was so important in that, because she's showing that when we create fear around different groups of people that we don't agree with, that this often accelerates the tensions that are already there, and that we need to approach these things so both sides are not escalating things so dramatically. You know, we need to come from these issues that, yes, we disagree, but we have to find common ground. And, you know, because like this, you know, this could end up resulting in, you know, something like, you know, that happened at Kent State. And so, you know, it's very, I think it's very, you know, speak to a lot of what is, you know, we can take a lot of messages from this, and it's still very relevant.
Okay. Any other questions? We have time for a couple more if there are other questions for Toni at all. And again, you can type them in the chat for me, and we will talk about them there. Or
I just have one more.
okay.
I hear you have said multiple times that this is a revolution. How in your eyes?
We didn't catch that weight at all. I think the sound broke out.
So I hear multiple times when you were speaking, I heard you refer to this time period as a revolution. How in your eyes is this a revolution?
I think because not only were they, you know, a lot of the focus was obviously around, like a lot of what the catalyst was opposing the Vietnam War, but there was all these different things that were stemming off of that as well. So, it, you know, it was gathering all these groups of people who were centered on one thing. But then this ended up creating like a revolution that was beyond the Vietnam War. It turned into, you know, civil rights. It turned into, you know, women's rights, gay rights, disability, people with disabilities, you know, all of these things eventually started allowing people to start a revolution, to really start actively changing things that weren't working for the people. And so, you know, through this collection of people is what really ended up splintering off into this massive, you know, revolution where people were willing to go out and fight for the changes that they wanted to see.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else with a question for Toni at all?